Welcome everyone to the next lecture in our Paleo-Indian series, co-sponsored with the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Library, and the Avon Senior Center. I'm Tina Panic. I'll be your host this evening in terms of controls for Q&A, chat box, and etc. Make sure that you can see and hear from the device you're logging in on. Please put any questions in the chat box or the Q&A. If you're joining us from outside Connecticut, please pop that in the chat box. We have a large map in the library. We're putting pins in for where all of our guests are joining us from, and we're gaining country pins as well as different states. So please put in where you're joining us from. The event will be recorded and we'll send the recording out to everyone tomorrow. And I'll turn it to Jen so she can say hello.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jennifer from the Avon Senior Center. I just want to say we're really excited to be participating with the Historical Society and the library on this series. And I'm already noticing that we have over 100 people joining us so far. So thank you for your interest. I don't know if you're as excited as we are, but I'm excited about tonight's topic, just like I think I get excited about every single topic and presenter. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of our series, sticking with us, and there's going to be some more fabulous things to come. So again, thank you, and get excited for tonight like we all are. I'm going to now pass it over to Terry Wilson. Go ahead, Terry.
Thank you. Good evening. On behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the Library and Senior Center, and the Planning Committee for this series called Unearthing History, I welcome you to the second event in this series, Ice Age Animals of New England. And the reason for this annual webinar series is the discovery in 2019 of the Brian D. Jones Paleo-Indian site along the Farmington River here in Avon, Connecticut. So to learn more about that site, there's various ways to do it, but you could also visit the Avon Historical Society's website. We have a drop-down page for this particular site in Avon. Tonight, we have the honor of having two speakers with tremendous expertise in Ice Age animals. The first is Dr. Sarah Sportman, the fourth Connecticut State Archaeologist, who, if I recall correctly, was awarded that position the day before our large public announcement was made about the Brian Jones site in February of 2020 at the Avon Senior Center. Some of you may have been with us for that historic event right before the pandemic. Dr. Sportman received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut with research interests in pre-contact Native American archaeology of the Northeastern United States. She's a National Park Service qualified historic archaeologist with 20 years experience designing and supervising field projects, permit applications, data analysis, laboratory work, and writing for many of the field's most prestigious journals. She has undertaken projects at historic house sites, historic Native American sites, burial recovery projects, industrial and military sites. When the discovery in Avon happened in 2019, she was senior archaeologist with Archaeological and Historical Services in Storrs, Connecticut, where Dr. David Leslie now holds that position, overseeing the analysis of the contents of the Brian Jones site. So tonight, she will speak on the recent analysis of the Pope Mastodon uncovered in Farmington, Connecticut in 1913. And we welcome Dr. Nathaniel Kitchel, a Robert A. 1925 and Catherine L. McKinnon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. Dr. Kitchel specializes in the study of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene populations of North America, which is the period of rapid climate warming in this region between 12 and 11,000 years ago. While planning this webinar since last year, Dr. Kitchel has been communicating with us from various parts of South America, where he has a strong interest in Andean archaeology, especially in Peru. He has a PhD from the University of Wyoming with areas of interest in geochemistry, settlement of the Americas, human behavioral ecology, and environmental archaeology. Tonight, he will speak on the recent radiocarbon dating work done on various remains of the Mount Holly mammoth found in Vermont in 1848 during the construction of the Burlington and Rutland Railroad. Very recently, he conducted research that discovered that this mammoth was most likely the last known occurring mammoth in the Northeast. So let's welcome Sarah and Nathaniel for what we know will be an incredible journey through the Ice Age. So I pass it off to you. Thank you.
Want me to share start, or who's going to go?
Yeah, by all means, let's work to the north, just like the glacial ice did. Hopefully we'll be more interesting.
Yeah. I'm at the end. Hold on a second. Okay, can everybody see that? I hope. So thank you everybody so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to be talking about the Farmington Mastodon, which is Connecticut's most famous example of Ice Age megafauna. But I'm going to kind of set that up a little bit by talking about the history of megafauna and the American imagination, then talk a little bit about the discovery of the Farmington Mastodon and its history over the last 100 years. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about recent research in the region that's pushing the dates for mastodons and human inhabitants of our region closer together, and looking at what these old and new discoveries tell us about Connecticut's history and environment at the end of the last ice age. So in late August of 1913, a remarkable mastodon skeleton was found in an upland swamp in Farmington, Connecticut. It was by far the most complete mastodon ever found in Connecticut. And when it was completely excavated, only some of the foot bones, tail vertebrae, and one tusk were missing. The discovery of such a well-preserved mastodon was thrilling and a major event locally. In the early 20th century, people were familiar with fossils, ancient megafauna, and the concept of extinction, but that was not always the case. Today, we know that North America was once home to many species of megafauna, such as mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and giant beavers, huge animals that dwarf their modern relatives. These creatures, which largely died out between 10 and 13,000 years ago, fascinated people because they reflected a natural world that was so much different than the modern one. People's knowledge about extinct species in deep time largely developed over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was fueled by fossil finds, the exploration and settlement of the far reaches of the globe, and the development of modern scientific thought and methods. When the first megafauna fossils were found by Europeans in North America, and of course, indigenous people had found them and thought about them for much, much longer. But when the first Europeans encountered them, they were a great mystery. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, modern scientific inquiry was in its infancy, and most people looked to their religious beliefs to explain the world around them. For example, in 1705, when the first documented colonial mastodon find was discovered, it caused both great excitement and consternation. That year, a Dutch farmer found a huge tooth on the banks of the Hudson River in Claverack, New York. Having no use for such a curiosity himself, the farmer quickly sold it to a local assemblyman for a gill of rum. Eventually, the tooth made its way to New York's governor, Lord Cornbury. Cornbury tried to get additional evidence of the creature. He sent people out to the find spot to dig for more bones. But although they found additional elements at the site, they immediately fell apart when removed from the soil. The tooth's discovery was covered in the press, and it drew the attention of many of the period's intellectuals. Lord Cornbury eventually sent the tooth to the Royal Society in London with a letter outlining his thoughts on the specimen. Cornbury believed it was the tooth of an antediluvian giant that had been killed and buried by the Great Flood, and at the time he was in good company. His idea was supported by Cotton Mather, who also opined on the specimen. And Massachusetts minister and poet Edward Taylor penned over 190 lines of verse about a huge creature and estimated its height at 60 to 70 feet. In the infancy of modern scientific thought, and in a time where much of the New World was still an unexplored mystery to Europeans, religion provided people with a framework for understanding it. To Mather, Cornbury, and others, the idea of a giant was completely reasonable, as not only were giants documented in the Bible, as you can see from the quote from Genesis at the bottom of the screen, but they had long been a part of European folklore as well. On top of that, the presence of giants in the New World seemed to be supported by the oral traditions of many indigenous groups who told of gigantic cultural heroes like Malshep among the Wampanoag and the stone giants in the Quinnipiac tradition. At first, the creature was called incognitum because no one could figure out quite what it was. Some believed it was a terrible monster capable of crushing deer, elk, and maybe even humans in its jaws, then that it had been drowned and buried by the Great Flood. Others believed it was the tooth of a large animal, but also likely one that had been a victim of the Great Flood. Since no such creatures were currently around, and God's creation was known to be permanent, many believed it had to have been carried to New York by the floodwaters. In 1705, the time of this discovery, solid scientific understanding of extinction was nearly 100 years away. However, fossil finds like Mastodon teeth got people thinking about it and questioning their worldview. Fossils of animals, unlike those currently on the earth, raised all kinds of uncomfortable questions about the nature of God's creation and the age of the earth. By the end of the century, Georges Cuvier had recognized that the remains were those of extinct animals related to modern elephants. He was among the first European naturalists to articulate a scientific theory of extinction, largely based on his study of mastodons and mammoths, as well as other fossils. And a lesser known aspect of Cuvier's work was that it was heavily informed by indigenous accounts and fossil finds from the Americas. He asked people to send him accounts and examples and talk to Native people and get their stories and experiences as well. So that actually informed a great deal of his theory of extinction. Now, despite the work of Cuvier and others demonstrating that many species had in fact gone extinct, in America, founding father Thomas Jefferson held out hope that some of these creatures might still be alive in the unexplored parts of the American West. Jefferson's interest in this was partially driven by his well-known obsession with scientific inquiry, but it was also based on his patriotism and nationalism for his fledgling nation. It was also, at least in part, a response to the idea of the French naturalist Georges Buffon, who put forth a theory of the degeneracy of all things in the New World. He argued that not only were people and animals and plants in the New World smaller, weaker, and more effeminate than those in Europe, but that the environment of the Americas actually ruined and degraded the European animals and people who went to live there. Jefferson and the other founding fathers saw the remains of megafauna as one line of direct evidence to counteract the theory. If these huge animals had lived in the New World, it was hardly a place for puny, effeminate species. Jefferson, who stood 6'2" tall, in particular, took it upon himself to challenge Buffon. He began sending the naturalists tables of measurements of American fauna as compared to Europeans and specimens, including mastodon bones. He even had a huge moose hunted and taxidermied in Vermont and sent overseas to France to refute the argument. By the 19th century, people were developing a clearer picture of the deep age of the earth. And development and expansion resulted in numerous fossil finds that helped piece together the ancient world and its plant and animal inhabitants. During the 19th century, several fragmentary mastodon finds were discovered in Connecticut as people dug canals and ponds and drained swamps to increase and improve farmland. Many theories have been put forth to explain the number of mastodon finds in ponds, bogs, and swamps. Some people postulate that the animals were driven into these areas by human hunters and other predators. Others have postulated that human mastodon kills were stored in these locations to lengthen their preservation. The most likely reason, however, is that they're found there because animals tend to die where they live, and mastodons primarily ate woody plants that grew near swamps and in wet woodlands. So moving on to talk about other Connecticut finds, other Connecticut mastodon finds. The first find recorded in Connecticut was in 1828 in Sharon. There's very little information about this find. We don't know what bones were found and what happened to them. The details are pretty much lost to history. That same year in Cheshire, Connecticut, during excavations for the Farmington Canal, some poorly preserved mastodon molars were recovered. Then, a couple of years later in 1833, a small local canal project in New Britain turned up mastodon vertebrae. Finally, in 1852, also in New Britain, mastodon ribs, limb bones, and teeth were recovered during the excavation of a pond. This specimen, which came to be known as the Ywca Mastodon, was once displayed at this Connecticut Normal School, which is now Central Connecticut State University. Those bones ended up in the collections at the Yale Peabody Museum, and it turned out they actually were combined with the earlier New Britain mastodon find of the vertebra. And those have been recently dated back in 2015, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Now, the Farmington Mastodon, which is also known as the Pope Mastodon, was found in 1913 on the Hill-Stead estate, a large estate that was over 200 acres. It was owned by the industrialist Alfred A. Pope and his wife, Ada. Today, Hill-Stead is a museum. The estate was designed by their daughter, Theodate Pope, who's a famous person in Connecticut history. She was one of the first registered female architects in the United States. She not only designed her parents' estate at Hill-Stead, she also designed and founded Avon Old Farm School. She was a fascinating character and a brilliant architect. She survived the Lusitania tragedy in 1915. And in terms of the story of the Farmington Mastodon, she played an important role in ensuring that it was properly excavated and studied. So moving forward to talk about the discovery of the mastodon, it was the late summer of 1913. And on the Hill-Stead estate, a group of Italian immigrant workmen were digging a ditch to drain a peat bog at the base of Farmington Mountain. Some accounts at the time stated that the workers came running up to the superintendent, Alan B. Cook, screaming about a black devil. There's a good chance this story is apocryphal. It was likely embellished by the press to add some color to the story by drawing on the stereotype of high-strung, superstitious immigrants. Alan Cook's son, who was a boy at the time and was present there that day, said the workers approached his father, who was the superintendent, because they pulled out what they had initially thought were big tree roots, but once they were out of the ground, they realized that they looked more like very large bones. I think that there was excitement, but probably not the fear that the papers portrayed at the time. Unfortunately, when they initially came across the bones, it was the cranium that they found first, and they thought it was the stump of a big tree and that the bones were roots, and they were kind of hacking and whacking at it, trying to dislodge it from the ground. So the cranium actually sustained quite a bit of damage in the initial discovery. Alan Cook immediately recognized that these were the bones of something old, rare, and important. He informed the popes, and they arranged through their attorney, most likely Theodate Pope arranged through their attorney, for a paleontologist, Charles Schuchert at Yale, to come to the site and see the find. Schuchert arrived at the site, immediately understood that they had the remains of a mastodon, and he quickly arranged an excavation. Hugh Gibb, a Peabody Museum, preparator, directed the careful excavation of the mastodon with the assistance of museum staff, as well as 5 of the laborers who had been involved in the initial find. The scientists identified the remains as those of an American mastodon, Mammoth americanum, and as the excavations progressed, it was clear that it was a remarkably complete skeleton. It took about 2 weeks to hand excavate most of the skeleton, and that's when they realized that the tusks were missing. Much of the mastodon they recovered was in excellent condition, like these forelimb bones shown here. Once they were removed from the ground, the major skeletal elements of the mastodon were wrapped in plaster of Paris to stabilize them for transport to the Yale Peabody Museum, where they were taken by truck. Later that fall, in November, the staff at Hill-Stead decided to enlarge the original excavation area for more irrigation purposes. And at that time, they recovered a tusk. It was found about 23 feet from the location of the skull. So this drawing from the 1914 publication on the mastodon find by Schuchert and Hull shows the layout of the mastodon remains as they were found at the site, including the one tusk that was found in November. And I believe that was on Thanksgiving Day off to the side that's marked by the letter B. But as you can see, it was largely articulated when it was found, so it had been only slightly disturbed over time. The mastodon find quickly became a public spectacle. The story was covered in the press locally and nationally. It was one of the most complete found in the Northeast, along with the Warren and Cohoes mastodons from New York. And if you've ever been to the New York State Museum and seen the mastodon that's mounted on display there, that's the Cohoes mastodon. Within a few days, hundreds of people were trying to get onto the property to get a look at the excavations and at the mastodon bones. So in the end, they had to build a fence and hire guards to protect the site as work continued to keep the sightseers out. The 1914 publication by Schuchert and Hull provided a great amount of detail about the find and the subsequent excavation of the mastodon. They depicted and explained the stratigraphy at the site, noting that the mastodon was found in a shallow trough directly on boulder clay, which is an early 20th century term synonymous with glacial till. They recorded that the mastodon was kind of encapsulated in 6 to 18 inches of clay that didn't have cobbles, and that was above that till. And the layer with the mastodon remains was found below a layer of 30 inches of fine clay that had a lot of organic materials in it. On top of that layer, at the top of the stratigraphic sequence, was about 18 inches of waterlogged peat. Once it was analyzed and published, Theodate Pope wished to have the mastodon returned to Farmington. She really wanted it to be put on display locally. Unfortunately, her desire to do this was never realized, and the mastodon remained stored in crates in Farmington until after her death in 1946. For the next several decades, the mastodon was stored in a variety of locations, including the Avon Old Farm School until 1956, the Connecticut Geological and Natural History Survey at Wesleyan until the 1970s, and then finally in 1979, the mastodon was finally put on display at the American Indian Archaeological Institute, which is now the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. In 1989, it was disassembled and sent to the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at UConn. In 2015, parts of it were again displayed at the Institute, but it has since been returned to UConn where it remains in storage. Now, in 2015, the late state archaeologist Brian Jones, my predecessor, decided to get the Farmington Mastodon dated. Working with Matthew Bullinger, he arranged to take a sample and send it off for AMS dating. They used a tusk fragment to get an accelerator mass spectrometry or AMS date to remove any contaminants from the bone. So I should note that over the years, when it was stored in different places like Yale and at the Institute, people had applied various chemicals and stabilizers and shellacs and different things to the surface in an effort to preserve it. So to remove any contaminants, a small section of tusk was sanded down and radiocarbon analysis was performed on collagen extracted from the tusk fragment. They used standard procedures for this, and it was done by a firm called Beta Analytic, which is one of the most commonly used places to get radiocarbon dates in the US. So they dated collagen from the tusk, and just to give you a little bit of information on that and the dating process, collagen is a key part of bone. It's a protein that provides kind of a soft framework for bones. And it's a good substance for carbon dating because it can preserve for a long time in bone. It's often found in really ancient specimens. Radiocarbon dating itself, if you want a quick kind of primer on that, is a way of telling the age of a once living thing by measuring the amount of carbon inside it. So carbon is an element that's found in every living thing on Earth, and it exists in different forms. One form of carbon inside living things is carbon-14, which is a radioactive form of carbon. So that means it's not stable and that it decays over time. Scientists know how fast carbon-14 decays. The rate of it is known. So by measuring how much of it remains in a dead organism, they can figure out how long it has been dead and therefore how old it is. So calibration of radiocarbon results is then needed to translate radiocarbon years into calendar years and put it into a format that we can all relate to. And that calibration accounts for changes in the atmospheric concentration of carbon-14 over time. So for the Farmington Mastodon, the results indicated that it was 12,430 plus or minus 40 radiocarbon years old, which calibrates to 14,900 to 14,200 years. As I mentioned before, Matthew Bullinger also dated the New Britain Mastodon, the Ywca Mastodon, and that one returned a younger date of 13,100 to 12,984 years. So that one's a little bit younger. So just to give you a sense, here's where the Farmington Mastodon kind of fits in with some of the other dated Mastodon finds in the region. It's one of the older ones, but you'll see there's kind of a pattern here. Most of the finds in the region range from about 4,800 to 12,000 years old. And that probably is a good indicator of, the time periods when they actually inhabited this area. And the extinction of these animals may be related to, a combination of climate change and habitat retraction, as well as possibly human pressures. Because it's not just, humans in an environment do a lot of things, right? It's not just that they might have been hunting these animals, but they also make other changes in an environment that can be disruptive. So it's probably a combination of factors that led to their extinction rather than any one thing. And that is probably true for all of the megafauna. And they might not have the same necessarily causes of extinction in different parts of the country either. I think there are other parts of the country where humans probably had a much larger impact than they did in the Northeast. So just to talk a little bit more about mammoths and mastodons, and I know that Nathaniel's going to cover mammoths in great detail, but I just wanted to kind of set up a discussion of the similarities and differences between the two. So to date, only mastodons and no mammoths have been found in Connecticut. Generally speaking, mastodons, which are on this map as the red dots, were more prevalent in Eastern North America, and mammoths, which are the blue dots, were more common out west. But fossil finds indicate that their habitats did overlap, and mammoths, of course, have been found in New England. So to kind of set up the similarity and differences between the two, mastodons were a distant relative of modern elephants, related but not closely. They inhabited primarily an eastern forest habitat. Physically, they had a flatter head than mammoths and straighter tusks, and their teeth are very different. If you can see the two teeth in the picture, Mastodon teeth have high ridges, which are adapted to browse in a spruce forest environment, and therefore really like consuming woody sticks, twigs, and brush. The name Mastodon is actually based on the shape of their teeth. Cuvier actually named it based on, it basically means breast tooth, because he thought that the cusps on the tooth of the mastodon looked like the teeth on an animal, basically. Mammoths, on the other hand, are a close relative of modern elephants. Physically, they have a distinctive kind of bony knob on the top of their skull. Their tusks are curved. They primarily inhabited Western grasslands, and they have flat teeth, very similar to those of modern elephants, that create a grinding surface for grazing on grass. So those are the major differences. So you can see that, the habitats that they would have preferred would have been quite a bit different. So dated mastodon remains from New York and New England indicate that mastodons arrived in our region on the heels of the Boreal Forest. So following the retreat of the glaciers between 17 and 18,000 years ago, the environment in New England began to change, with especially rapid environmental shifts between 15 and 11,000 years ago. A warming event known as the Bullering-Allerod, which occurred near the end of the last glacial period, around 14,600 BP, facilitated the expansion of boreal forest vegetation into the northeastern US. So you can see from these two images here, the extent of the glacier at about 18,000 years ago, and then by 13,000 years ago, it had retreated quite a bit, and we have an open boreal woodland kind of environment in our region. So boreal forests are dominated by conifers. They're kind of an image of one here in this picture, but they also support a range of other plants, including scattered deciduous trees, shrubs, mosses, herbs, berries. And the development of this vegetation rendered the area habitable for mastodons, as well as other species like caribou, bears, wolves, and small mammals. But the establishment of this flora and fauna also opened up the region for human settlement. This raises the question of whether humans and mastodons coexisted in our region. So the first people to live in what is now Connecticut are known to archaeologists as Paleo-Indians. To date, the earliest human habitation sites documented in Connecticut are the Brian D. Jones site in Avon at 12,600 years BP, which I know you've heard all about, as well as the Templeton site in Washington, Connecticut, which is dated to about 12,000 years ago, and that has also been featured in presentations in this series. Sites in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania have been dated a little bit earlier to about 12,800 years ago. But given what we know about local environmental conditions, it's possible that people were here earlier than that. Although at this point, we don't have direct evidence for that. There's no question that humans and megafauna interacted in other parts of the country. Here's a map showing some sites where there's archaeological evidence of human hunting or scavenging megafauna. Note that there aren't any in the East at the moment. Cultural artifacts have been found in association with numerous megafauna remains, indicating that people, hunted or scavenged the animals. In our region, it's certainly a strong possibility as well. While the Farmington Mastodon is probably a little bit too old, dating it over 14,000 years ago, that's much earlier than our documented dates for human settlement in southern New England, other megafauna dates indicate a strong potential for overlap. So there's the Mount Holly mammoth, which Nathaniel's going to talk about, as well as the Northborough Mastodon in Massachusetts at 13,100 BP. Those were both dated last year. And the New Britain Mastodon, which was 13,100 as well. So while we have no material archaeological evidence in New England to date for human interaction with megafauna, you may have heard in Dave Leslie's last talk about the Brian Jones site that they actually found traces of elephant blood protein residue on a large side scraper from the Jones site. While such analyses have for protein residue, people have called them into question in the past. There have been some problems with contamination and things like that. They were very careful in this case. They took samples of the soil nearby as well, which did not return any strange proteins. It was very clearly came back as elephant protein. They got different protein readings on other tools. So it seems like a pretty good analysis and a pretty good result. So while a projectile point stuck in a mastodon bone or other stone tools found with a skeleton would be better evidence, it seems like a good indication that people in mastodons were sharing the landscape, at least for a short while here in Connecticut. And, even if they were, it doesn't necessarily mean that people hunted them. They may have also scavenged them. That's, up for debate in this area. So what we know is that, the dates from archaeological sites and megafauna are coming closer and closer together here in New England. We know that the environment could have supported humans earlier and mastodons later than the current finds suggest. So it seems likely that they overlapped and interacted. And this is really strengthened from the protein residue from the Jones site. So before I finish up, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the Farmington Mastodon and its potential future for years, people have talked about this specimen. It really is something that people are excited about and people want to see it on display. Back in 2017, Dr. Robert Thorson from Connecticut wrote an editorial about it. Let's drag it out of UConn's closet. And it is currently in storage at the Connecticut Museum of Natural History in stores. And there is a long-term goal to reestablish the museum in a physical space with that mastodon as a centerpiece. But it's a little bit challenging. First of all, that would be incredibly expensive, but it is a thing that people are thinking about. And back in 2017, we had an assessment done of the mastodon remains to kind of figure out what it would take to get it put together as an exhibit, to get it articulated and set up like some of the mastodons that you've seen in other museums. So Dr. Natalie Monroe is an archaeologist at UConn, and some of her grad students examined the mastodon back in 2017. They inventoried the remains, got a sense of what was present, what was missing, what was damaged. and they made some recommendations for repairs and conservation. So, it's possible, but a number of repairs and replacement parts would be needed to get the mastodon set up and articulated as an exhibit. It would require reconstructions of portions of the crania that was damaged during the initial discovery, as well as the scapula and pelvis bones, which are also fragmented, and those would be really important for the structural soundness of standing up the mastodon. They'd probably need to do plastic casts or 3D prints of some of the missing skeletal elements, particularly the lower forelimbs, some of the ribs and foot bones, which are missing. And some conservation would have to be done on it. Remember I mentioned earlier that it had been treated with a number of chemicals and other preparations over the years in hopes of conserving it. Probably that would have to be removed. It would have to be stabilized, and it would have to, have cracks and other things like that repaired. And then the mounting itself would be very expensive. But, that's something that we all want to happen, and it's something that people are thinking about. So I would say in terms of that, stay tuned, and let's all hope that we can pull it off. So that's pretty much everything I have. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the program. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. If anyone has questions while they're fresh in your mind, pop them in the chat box. And then Nathaniel's going to get his slides set up. I just want to also remind everyone our next lecture in this series is on May 12th. And I put the link right in the chat box. You're welcome to register right now while we're waiting for the slides to start. Or if you'd prefer, you can wait till tomorrow when we send the recording out, and the link to register will be right there. Those of you who have been with most of this series know that it's one-stop shopping the day after the video. And when everything comes out, you get the links for the next couple of lectures, and you get the recordings from the previous ones. All right. Floor is yours.
All right.
Great, we can see those.
Can you see them?
Yep, we can.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. That was actually a really wonderful setup to some of the things that I'm going to talk about, and maybe delve more into the controversy surrounding the possibility of human-mammoth interactions, both here and other parts of North America, and how it's become something of a heated archaeological debate that has caused people to decamp to various sides and maybe not take as nuanced a position as perhaps it could be both climate and human interaction. But we'll get to that. I really appreciate you having me. It's my pleasure to be here. My segue into this sort of archaeological and paleontological debate is some recent work that I've done on the Mount Holly mammoth in Mount Holly, Vermont, near the town of Ludlow. It was recovered at the spine of the Green Mountains. When I talk about these Ice Age animals, I like to talk about how New England was very much a different world when these animals first moved in here, and actually when the first human populations that we were aware of in the region moved in as well. And as many of you probably know, glacial ice blanketed much of virtually all of what's now New England, all the way down to Long Island. In fact, the island of Long Island is a terminal moraine for the Laurentide ice sheet, the ice sheet that covered much of North America during the Pleistocene or the Ice Age. Now, as that ice retreated, it drastically altered the landscape of southern and northern New England, and really transformed it into something that we wouldn't really recognize if we were to be dropped there 12,000 years ago or 13,000 years ago. Now, this was a map that I made, and it's, I admit, sort of amateurish. But what I've got here is in the in the northeast, the Champlain Sea here, as well as the bay. And this is mapping the Presumpscot Formation. This is a glacial marine clay that's actually now beached in certain parts of New England. So you can see where the ocean actually came within about 50 kilometers of Mount Katahdin in Maine. So much of the south coast of Maine was in fact underwater. But in using this map, I always say all maps are wrong, especially in terms of what was going on here during the final Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age. And earlier earlier this week, I found some really great slides illustrating that. So really to orient us here, here's Cape Cod, here's central Maine, northern Canada, the St. Lawrence River, right? And you can see here at 13,000 radiocarbon years before present, or about 15,000 years ago, much of what is Cape Cod, southern New England, and much of the New England coast was actually underwater. And moving forward in time, and here is the ice sheet, it's just shaded here. Moving forward in time, you can see that the land starts to rise. And this may seem paradoxical because as the ice melts, obviously sea levels are going up, but what's also happening here at the same time is the land is going up as well. That glacial ice is enormously heavy, so heavy that it actually pushes the Earth's crust down. And when that ice melts, the land starts to rebound, a process geologists call isostatic uplift. And that is a process that was very much in play throughout New England during the end of the ice age as that ice melted. And so you can see as you move forward in time, right, 12,000 radiocarbon years or 13,900 years ago, when you calibrate it, as Sarah explained, you can see more and more land is exposed here, 11,000 radiocarbon years before present, or about 13,000 years ago. So right before we have really good evidence for the first human Native American populations moving into the region. And then subsequently, sea level rise starts to overtake the isostatic rebound and begins to submerge the coast of New England more and more and more. So a very dynamic and different world as the ice age moves forward. And here we are today after the ice. So not only was that landscape fundamentally different, so obviously were the animals that inhabited it. And Dr. Sportman talked a bit about some of the animals that we have documented in New England, mammoth, mastodons, a giant beaver, a stag moose, sort of like a cross between a moose and an elk, but not really biologically, but a large elk-like creature. In other parts of the continent, other animals, of course, your mammoths, your mastodons, a whole different proboscidean or elephant-like species, the Gomphotherium, a little bit smaller yet, the American lion, Smilodon or saber-toothed cat, and an armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, camels, horses, bison, giant sloths, a whole menagerie of fantastic beasts, most of which we don't have evidence for here in New England. One that's not listed here, but that we do have evidence for in the Northeast is in fact a musk ox, because as you might suspect, the ice age climate of northern New England and New England in general was much colder than it is today during many times in the past. In fact, so cold that now an Arctic adapted species was present in northern New York. One of my favorite creatures here, just talking about the landscape that the first humans to enter into the Americas would have found and the animals that were on it, and some of them enormously dangerous, like lions and saber-toothed cats. But this one's particularly scary to me. This is a short-faced bear. So this is about a third, again, the size of a grizzly bear, except it's like you put it on stilts. So it's a long-legged bear weighing well over 1,000 pounds. It's estimated to have been able to run at 45 miles an hour and is also thought to have hunted in packs. So an absolutely terrifying predator guild that the first humans would have encountered when they got here. Not just elephants, not just mastodons and giant ground sloths, but also enormous predators that were probably also feeding on those animals as well. Now, it's taken us a long time as scientists to reach at this sort of understanding, and Sarah alluded to a lot of that, right? A lot going on, a lot of research, and really starting in the early history, most of that was explained via biblical explanations. Now, that did in fact start to change with the discovery of some of these fossils. Now, obviously, fossils were found much earlier than this Mount Holly find, but the Mount Holly mammoth was one of the first relatively complete finds of mammoth in North America, found in 1848 during the construction of the Burlington and Rutland Railroad. Now, what this find also started to started to point out to is not just that extinctions happened, but that there were different geologic epochs, and that these fossils could actually be indicative of those specific time periods, right? And the Pleistocene, the Ice Age that I've talked about, this is the mammoths and mastodons, these extinct megafauna, are markers of that. Now, geologists may have come up with the idea of the Pleistocene, of the Ice Age, but in 1848, no one actually knew how old that was, right? So it was really trying to understand when something happened. You had to do it relatively, right? So we knew that mammoths and mastodons were extinct, therefore they were probably old. But how old? 5,000 years, 100,000 years? It wasn't really possible to say, right? Now, this is fundamentally important to an early archaeological debate, which is problematic in many ways, but it is the idea of when did the first humans arrive in North America? And early on, a lot of scholars who were steeped into some pretty serious racism said that the first indigenous inhabitants of North America had arrived here quite late, and certainly did not overlap in time with any of the megafauna, and were not here during the Pleistocene, right? So setting up the story. And that was the general narrative for quite a long time, is that there were no solid associations between ancient humans, ancient indigenous Americans, and megafauna here in North America. Now, that would finally change by one of the most famous discoveries in Paleo-Indian archaeology in Folsom, New Mexico. This is something that we go over in all of our intro to North American archaeology classes. And that was the association of this very specific looking projectile point stuck between the ribs of an extinct bison species, Bison antiquus. So larger than modern day bison, and decidedly extinct. Now, this was finally accepted in the 1920s, obviously well after the Mount Holly discovery, and decades after this debate had begun. Now, what's really important about the Folsom find is the form of this fluted point. And I know now that you've had a number of discussions about the Brian D. Jones site and perhaps the Templeton site by Dr. Zach Singer, right? You know about fluted points and that they're remarkably distinctive, right? And they themselves, much like mammoths or mastodons, serve as a really nice marker fossil, an index fossil talking about, or that test how old something was. And once these fluted points, these very distinctive projectile points with this flute that's driven right up the middle, very difficult to make, and unique to this time period, people began to find them all over the place throughout North America. Not long after the discovery in Folsom, New Mexico, similar but not identical points were found at the nearby Blackwater Draw locality associated with mammoth remains. Now, the Blackwater Draw locality is also close to Clovis, New Mexico, giving them their name of Clovis Points. And these are not Clovis Points from Blackwater Draw, but rather particularly spectacular examples from the Drake Cache in Colorado. And again, smaller flutes, but really just spectacularly crafted, really works of art, really quite beautiful. And of course, as you all now know, we have very similar points just like this here in New England, various different designs thought to be associated with different ages themselves, continuing to be index fossils. These Kings Road Whipple, the most similar to Clovis Points, Vale de Burt, a little bit more derived from a classic Clovis form, as some archaeologists like to define it. These Michaud-Neponset points, which are actually quite similar to Folsom Points, this being a particularly beautiful example made on Redwood Sungan Chert from far northern Maine, yet found in New Hampshire. And then Bulbrook forms from the famous Bulbrook site in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Excuse me. So this Michaud-Neponset point, the Intervale point, was actually found at the end of the 19th century in central New Hampshire as well. Again, until the discovery in Folsom, New Mexico, folks simply didn't realize the significance of this find and just thought it an odd, interesting artifact, right? So what changed that was radiocarbon dating, and Sarah talked a bit about it, but it wasn't invented until 1949 by Willard Libby as an offshoot of the Manhattan Project, of all things, which won him the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And very simply, as was alluded to, right, you can just, as Sarah talked about, right, the decay of carbon-14 can be measured very precisely now. And what Willard Libby did was he measured the concentrations of carbon-14 in various objects that were of known age, that people had been kind enough to write down how old they were, right? So Egyptian sarcophagi, then, for example, something you could count back year to year to year, like tree rings in a redwood stump, and going back even, and so on and so forth, right? So what Willard Libby determined was that the half-life, how long it takes for half of that radioisotope to decay, was about 5,730 years, or excuse me, 5,568 years, which has been revised to 5,730 by more modern methods. So now, using that method, scientists could begin to understand when megafauna once roamed the landscape and when the people who hunted them overlapped with them. And what began to appear when folks started to go out and get radiocarbon dates for these now extinct animals was a pretty strong pattern. A smattering of early dates, 15,000, 20,000, 18,000. But the end dates all started to cluster around 13,000 to 12,900 years ago. Over and over and over again. You go out and you date a mammoth, and it would never be older than 12,900 to 13,000 years ago. Dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And the other pattern that began to emerge was when you went out and began to date these very ancient archaeological sites that contain fluted points, the very earliest of them always seemed to date right around that same period, right around 13,000 years ago to 12,900 years ago, these Clovis sites, and Folsom being a little bit younger. And that association caused some folks to suggest that perhaps these were related, right? And proposed a hypothesis to explain why the last mammoths seemed to disappear right around the same time that the first humans appear on the landscape, and how to explain the presence of fluted points across the entire continent almost instantaneously. And most famously, this was put forth by a paleontologist at the University of Arizona, Paul Martin, who named it, now sort of unfortunately, named it the Blitzkrieg Hypothesis, now rebranded as the overkill hypothesis. Sometime later, actually my PhD advisor, Bob Kelly, and a professor of mine in my undergraduate work, Larry Todd, proposed that it was in fact naive prey that allowed Arctic adapted hunters, folks coming across from Northeast Asia, across the Bering Strait, adapted to big game hunting, encountered a landscape full of animals that had no idea that humans were some of the most dangerous predators on the planet. And as they depleted or frightened local populations, that population of humans moved rapidly across the continent, thus explaining the near instantaneous appearance of fluted points across a continental scale landmass. Okay. So now the overkill hypothesis. Of course, it seems like an elegant model, but of course, science is all about debate and challenging people's information and ideas, right? That's how we check ourselves and make sure that everything, that we're not going away on some wild tangent. And this is exactly the case for the overkill hypothesis. Most famously, an archaeologist named Dave Meltzer and a paleontologist named Donald Grayson authored several papers that said, hey, overkill just doesn't work, mainly because there are very few archaeological sites that actually have good human mammoth associations. Sure, there are some locations that like maybe have potential evidence for human mammoth interactions, but most of them are not that great. As Sarah said, there's very few places that actually have a fluted point stuck between mammoth ribs, and in fact, there's almost none. What Grayson and Meltzer ended up doing was establishing some very strict criteria for what they would accept as a human mammoth association, right? Which was then pushed back on by, former professors of mine, Todd Suravel and Nicole Wagaspak, who took Grayson and Meltzer's criteria and said, hey, well, if you go and actually use those criteria and look at all of these mammoth kills across North America, you get 14. And 13, if you find 13 instances of a phenomenon from 13,000 years ago, that's a lot. Overkill back on. You can't refute overkill using Grayson and Meltzer's criteria. And using that now from their 14 mammoth kills, right? These clusters here, Blackwater Draw, New Mexico, the San Pedro River Valley of Arizona. This is the Fin del Mundo site in Arizona, Dumbo, and various others, the Mud Lake Mastodon, so on and so forth, can add two more to this, one of which is Fin del Mundo in Mexico. That has been found since the Suravel and Wagaspak paper was published. And then this one here, which is near and dear to my heart when I was working in the University of Wyoming. This is the Laprelle Mammoth site, and it's another recently discovered human mammoth interaction site with an associated campsite, which is just enormously rare. There's all sorts of cool stuff with the Laprelle Mammoth site. And my colleague Madeline Mackey at Weber State University in Utah can talk all about that if you ever want to contact her. Very, very cool site, absolutely amazing. A cool counterpoint to some of the stuff that we have in New England. And this debate has come to the Northeast as well. And so Sarah mentioned Matt Belanger doing some of the dating for with Brian Jones of some megafauna in Connecticut and in other parts of the Northeast. And he went out and began dating all of these megafaunal finds, as many as he could get a hold of and be permitted to date, and found a pattern of his own, which was that if you start to do these dates, we don't get an overlap in New England when he wrote this paper, right, which was in 2014. So it seems that the decline of megafauna in the Northeast really preceded the first really strong evidence of humans in the area, but by quite a bit. There was minimal overlap, and if you have minimal overlap, then it's really hard to implicate humans in the destruction of these species, driving them to extinction. And this is a graphic from Belanger's paper looking at the radiocarbon date frequencies of megafauna down here and human archaeological sites here. And again, up here where they're modeled, you can see minimal overlap. Now, this is what made me so excited to return to the gelatinous muck of Mount Holly, as it was described in one publication, one relatively recent publication. So beyond the tusk pictured here, excavations in 1848 recovered another more degraded tusk, a molar, and an unspecified number of bones. Unfortunately, the documentation for the Mount Holly mammoth is not as good as the Farmington Mastodon that Sarah described. And it was discovered by railroad workers blasting through the summit of the Green Mountains, where they blasted through the final rock outcrop and on the summit, and then dug through a bog. And they described it as about 12 feet down. They came across a quote unquote enormous tooth, which was then followed by a number of other enormous bones that they themselves were, much like the Farmington Mastodon, sitting right on the top of glacial till, which they called a boulder layer. But unfortunately, while they were doing that, there's only a record of a handful of specific elements. So although the remains were originally slated to be donated to the Geology Museum at the University of Vermont, which is now the Perkins Museum, The remains were ultimately then transported to what was then Harvard College, now Harvard University, for further study by John C. Warren, who was then writing a book on elephants in North America, and Louis Agassiz, who was a preeminent geologist at the time. So sometime prior to 1865, Agassiz returned the best preserved tusk and a cast of the molar to Vermont, while Warren retained the other portions of the remains. Is this sounding familiar? An elephant on the move, just like Sarah talked about. So this is a pretty common phenomenon, it seems. So Warren retained the other portions of the remains. And at Harvard, these materials were incorporated into Warren's larger collection that was later purchased by J.P. Morgan, yes, that J.P. Morgan, the very, very wealthy one, and donated to the American Museum of Natural History, which was specifically, Morgan purchased those remains because he wanted to get the Warren Mastodon, which Sarah also mentioned. So the Clovis Mastodon might be at the main state museum, but the Warren Mastodon is at the National Museum of American History. And that's thanks to J.P. Morgan. And it turns out the Mount Holly remains went with it. And they remained there, not on display, not part of the permanent display, until 1920, when they were returned to Harvard, to the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. So the materials returned as it stands now included the molar and an unspecified number of skeletal elements. However, an inspection of the Mount Holly remains in 2014 and 15 now at Harvard shows that the remains of both shows that the Mount Holly collection, the items that are now indicated to have come from Mount Holly, include the remains of both mammoth and mastodon, and actually probably multiple mammoths based on the number of distinct individual bones. And there's not any record of mastodon remains being recovered from Mount Holly. Now, granted, the records weren't that good, but it stands to reason that people would have noticed two different kinds of teeth. They were aware of the difference between mammoths and mastodons, as we all know at this point after Sarah's talk. So what this seems to indicate is that those remains have become commingled with elephant bones from who knows where. So elephant bones from other locations. And so the inability to reliably attribute any of the materials at Harvard, save the molar, has limited the research potential of these remains. This leads me to an unexpected discovery, or why I'd rather be lucky than good any day. So in the fall of 2019, I was invited to the offsite storage facility of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College to look at some Native American artifacts that they had been donated by various people through the years that were from New England. This is my area of expertise, and to see if I could maybe add anything to what they already knew about those pieces. And certainly there were a lot of different individual things. As I was leaving, what really struck me in this New England collection was a big old bone. And it wasn't a cow bone, it wasn't a horse bone. I mean, I'm not a zooarchaeologist, I'm not a paleontologist, but you know, it struck me as weird. So obviously I had to take a look, and what did I find when I did that was this. And it says right there on this sticker, rib of fossil elephant, Mount Holly Railroad cut, presented by William A. Bacon, Esquire, from 1848. All right, really neat. So needless to say, I was intrigued. I was aware of the Mount Holly mammoth. I was aware that it was one of the most complete mammoth finds, proboscidean finds, elephant finds from Vermont. And obviously also having in the back of my mind this important question of the overlap with humans and megafauna, not just in New England and in other parts of the continent, with that sort of with the debate, the overkill debate. And so I began to wonder, be like, well, is it really Is it really from the Mount Holly mammoth? And it says here, William A. Bacon. So you do some archival research. And I had found a record of William A. Bacon in Ludlow, a town right next to Mount Holly, in 1852, where he was publishing a weekly paper called The Blotter. However, after I published these results, an interested member of the public had dug into the archives deeper than I could ever hope to do. Was actually found that not only was William A. Bacon living in Ludlow in 1848, but he was actually working as a surveyor for the railroad at that time, which really gives him great potential to have gotten a hold of a piece of this animal and added it to his sort of cabinet of curiosities, if you will, and then subsequently donated it to Dartmouth College. Why he may have done that, don't really know. We don't think he was a student at the college, but perhaps as a preeminent educational institution in between Vermont and New Hampshire, that's just where his mind went. We don't really know. But it was a pretty unexpected discovery because there was no record of any of the previously published literature pointing to the fact that this was donated to the college or ever existed at all. So given that and how exciting I thought this was, because mammoths are really neat, my colleague at Dartmouth, Jerry DeSilva, and I submitted a sample of this rib to the Center of Applied Isotope Studies at the University of Georgia for accelerator mass spectrometry dating, or AMS, which is standard technique now. And we got an unexpected result, which Sarah has mentioned, but I think it's important to put it into context when there's that, when Matt Belanger has spent a great deal of time dating a large number of megafauna in the Northeast. You don't expect your result to be different. I had a friendly sort of office pool with some other interested folks in the proboscidean world. And I think that the average date that we came up with was probably around 14,000 years old, was how old we expected this thing to be. Probably right in line with a lot of the other mammoth and mastodon finds. You certainly don't expect it to be young. But this analysis returned a radiocarbon date of 10,860 plus or minus 30. Or when you calibrate that into regular old calendar years before present, 12,790 to 12,690, the 95% confidence interval. This makes it one of the youngest elephants to have been discovered in New England up here. There are others that have a similar age range, like the Berry Mammoth, which was actually a bone found off the coast in the Proto-Merrimack River Valley between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The Farmington Mastodon, which we now know all about, the Grimes Mastodon, also submerged off the coast. It's a pretty strong pattern. Merrimack River Mastodon, submerged, Merrimack River again. New Britain, several from Connecticut, and a couple that are missing on here because when I published these results, some of the results from the other radiometric dates of mammoths and mastodons in this southern New England was not available. So we're making really big progress. I think it's really cool. So I guess I can say that this Mount Holly used to be one of 9 well-dated proboscideans in New England, but I guess there's at least 10 now. Although as far as I know, it's still one of the youngest that is out there. Although the Berry Mammoth is also quite young. But nonetheless, Mount Holly is the one that has the best probability for overlapping with people. Well, another reason I think that this is really quite cool is that it's sort of a mammoth of superlatives. It's found here at the spine of the Green Mountains. It is found in a bog, as it seems that elephants really liked these swampy areas, albeit mammoths and mastodons, of course, did have different environmental preferences. And it may also be that bogs are some of the only places in New England that readily preserve bone for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, save for being inundated under the ocean. That also seems to do a pretty good job of it. I guess I'm going to have to update this map in the future. But a mammoth it's a high elevation mammoth. It's the mammoth that was discovered at the highest elevation. And it's the only specimen from Vermont. which is quite cool for me being from Vermont. And it has this being the most precisely dated proboscidean that has a reasonable probability for temporal overlap with the first humans in New England. So just as Sarah said, with the finds at Brian D. Jones' site, this date from Mount Holly, as well as a handful of others, it seems like the temporal range of humans and megafauna in New England are just growing closer and closer together, if not overlapping completely. And of course, keep in mind, this is just the youngest date that we've gotten from a proboscidean in the region. Certainly, we're never going to date the last one. Obviously, these creatures were on the landscape well after the Mount Holly mammoth died. We just can't be sure how much longer, and that's part of the question. It'd be very exciting to find that human mammoth association here in New England somewhere. I'd love for someone to report that tomorrow. We'll see. We're going to have to wait, but we seem to be moving forward in the archaeological community, which I think is really quite cool. So I guess I'm saying there's a chance. Cool stuff. Now, one of the other things that we did when we dated the Mount Holly mammoth was to look at the stable isotopes of various elements in the bone beyond carbon, right? So carbon-14 is not a stable isotope because it decays, but there are others that you can look at when you do this mass spectrometry technique, and you can count them up. One of them is carbon-13, it's a slightly different form of carbon as well, but one that is not radioactive and does not decay. And then nitrogen-15. And these are telling you a little bit about the diet of these animals. And one of the weird things about mammoths is that they have enriched nitrogen. And enriched nitrogen usually means you're higher up the trophic scale. That is, that you're higher up the amount of meat that you're eating in your diet. And mammoths, for whatever reason, and as from the research that I've done, it's not really clear, mammoths have elevated nitrogen-15 in their bones compared to mastodons, which look a lot more like plant eaters. So whatever mammoths are doing, it's different. Some interest, they're not eating meat. They don't have the teeth to do that. But the people have implicated that they are eating nitrogen-fixing plants, that they're eating very specific browse that is enriched in nitrogen, that they're eating dirt, that they're eating their own poop, all sorts of weird explanations, but it is a mystery. So people are searching for what might be going on, except for the Mount Holly mammoth, which actually plots down here with mastodons. Interesting. So what that might mean is open for debate, but it may mean that given those environmental preferences, with mastodons being more mastodons liking browsing sticks and woody plants, and we know this because people there have been places where that material has been found has been found preserved within their body cavities, and mastodons largely grazing, eating grass, grinding it with those grinding teeth. It may be that the Mount Holly mammoth was forced to eat plants and eat things that it didn't normally eat. So it might have been a stressed individual. It might be related to some sort of environmental stressor at the end of the Ice Age that was driving it into a different environmental niche that mammoths didn't prefer. More work needs to be done. It's just one data point. It could be an outlier, but it's an interesting data point nonetheless. So things that I'm excited about doing would be for future research with Mount Holly and other megafaunal finds and extinct animal finds in New England. One, I'd like to confirm the taxonomic identity of the rib housed at the Hood Museum of Art, except I've already done that. So I sent a small sample of the rib off for a different analysis, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, known as ZOOMS. It's not quite DNA analysis, but it's a proteomic. It's a proteomic method, so it looks at specific proteins to sort things out by species. And because they're not actually that closely related, as Sarah mentioned, mammoths and mastodons can be teased apart using this technique. And indeed, the rib housed at the Hood Museum of Art is a mammoth. It's not a mastodon rib, masquerading as the Mount Holly mammoth rib, so that those relatively depleted nitrogen 15 levels are they are legit. It's not a mastodon. I'd like to get another date. Just one date. They're prone to error. Again, as Sarah mentioned, these remains can be contaminated with preservatives that were placed on the bones through time, and just you can imagine all of the organic gunk that could accumulate within bones at the bottom of a bog for the better part of 13,000 years. I'm still really excited to obtain additional radiocarbon dates for other megafauna in northern New England, and then fortunately other people are too, so that's really awesome. And then, just on a wing and a prayer, go out and test the Mount Holly site for the presence of intact deposits capable of preserving additional remains. The railroad dug through the bog right where the railroad wanted to go. They didn't take all of it. There's still more bog up there that might contain other bits and pieces of the Mount Holly mammoth, which is pretty incomplete, or perhaps, if you're really lucky, another proboscidean in general. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to my talk, and thank you all for coming. It's been my pleasure.
All right, thank you, Nathaniel. We do have a couple of questions, and the first is, can you explain what BP stands for in the dating and what that abbreviation means, and a little more of what it adjusts for?
Oh yeah, Sarah, do you have a radiocarbon calibration curve slide?
Not handy.
Okay, I have one here somewhere, so I'll share. So let me go. I've got all sorts of stuff: glacial lakes, Lake Champlain. This is radiocarbon calibration. So, like Sarah said, the atmospheric concentration of radiocarbon has changed through time, and that throws off the relationship between a radiocarbon age and a calendar age, an actual age in like years that we're all familiar with. You can see from this plot going back through time, if it was a one-to-one relationship, it would just be this line. Mm-hmm. This is the calibration curve, which is developed by looking, by taking radiocarbon measurements from things that their age of, like tree rings. There's a European record that's been developed on European oaks that have been either alive and then linked back together through tree ring dating from trees that have been dug up in bogs. I think that goes back 8,000 to 10,000 years now without a break. And then there are other places that have annually laminated sediments, like the Cariaco Basin of Venezuela, Lake Sugetsu in Japan, and you can take dates from those individual years and you can count them because they're rings and know exactly how many years you've got and what the offset is from the radiocarbon age. So when you do that calibration, you bring those back together. You say, okay, I've got this radiocarbon age of 10,280 plus or minus 30, which is the error range on the date. And then you plot it on the curve, which if you zoom in is a big old mess sometimes. And what that does is take a nice distribution, like a fairly normal looking radiocarbon distribution, and makes it a big mess, but it allows you to actually know with more precision what the age range of that date is. Okay. So when we talk about BP, we're talking about before present, which is 1950, when you calibrate those. So those are calibrated dates before 1950.
Okay, thank you. That was very thorough. And I'm going to stick with the dating theme just as we get to the next question. Are you able to do this kind of analysis for other Ice Age animals, perhaps overkill of the giant beaver? Our audience loves those giant beavers. I've got to
Everyone loves the giant beaver. Sarah, how many giant beavers are extant, or remains of giant beavers are extant in New England?
I don't know, but I'm sure there's a few.
I mean, I don't know that anyone's doing the radiocarbon work on them, and that seems like a major oversight.
No, yeah, maybe it's a niche market that we.
There's a terrific graphic of a human next to a giant beaver, and I think that just sends in all of our heads a huge wow. How could that possibly be? And my question, of course, is if they had great big tusks, what do? Take trees down in one swipe versus now when they have to like gnaw through them? I mean, how big could those teeth? Well, anyway, that's my question. But anyway, Tina, go right ahead.
All right. So we've just given you more work with the beaver analysis. Another audience member would like to know what the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 mean on the stable isotopes graph.
Oh, those accord to actual elephants or different proboscideans. So those just were names of different fine spots in New England that also have stable isotopes.
Next question is and we want to make sure we're getting this right, so it's a clarification question. The mammoths are closely related to elephants, correct? Okay, so the blood protein found at the Brian P. Jones site would indicate the presence of mammoths?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Both related to elephants. I mean, it's possible, but given the evidence, we don't have any mammoths to date in Connecticut. It would be more parsimonious to suggest mastodon, but I don't think we can be clear on that either way.
All right, so that's still a ellipses ...
Yeah.
Okay, got it. That's fine. We just wanted to clarify that part of the dating. All right, then bigger question, more of a big picture question from one of our audience members. With such dramatic changes in sea level, climate, ice coverage, vegetation having happened in just the last 14,000 years, is it realistic to think we can stop climate change by cutting back CO2 emissions, et cetera, et cetera? It's an are we in charge of this question?
I mean, are we in? So yeah, climate changes, but we are responsible for what's happening now. And the thing about climate change, in my perspective, is that it's not something to be taken lightly, because as archaeologists, and I think Sarah, I hope would think you would agree, right? When you have major climate change events, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And you don't know necessarily how climate is going to respond. And I think that that's often something that's said is like, well, climate always changes naturally. And that's true. But we have been in a period of very stable climate for the past 10,000 years, at an epoch called the Holocene. And what seems to have occurred during the Holocene is basically everything that we call civilization, agriculture for the most part, occurs during this period of stability. And I'll tell you what keeps me up at night is if somehow our meddling with the climate system knocks it into a less stable, more Pleistocene-like pattern, where you don't know what is going to happen from one year to the next, which would basically make agriculture really, really, really difficult. We're also talking about being responsible for the drowning of most major coastal cities. Right, like this is a pretty serious thing. So yeah, okay, fine. Climate change has happened naturally in the past, but I think when it's our responsibility and also has major potential implications for human life and like how we live, I think it's probably it would be deeply irresponsible to not try to do something about it when we know that it's our fault.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, natural climate change that's happened in the past, right? As Nathaniel's saying, it has a variety of different outcomes, but it almost always results in some that are catastrophic for different species. And I think that in this particular case, we know that we're the driver of this climate change. This isn't a natural phenomenon. So, it is our responsibility, because we've caused this and we're aware of it, to do what we can to try to counteract it. And I think, the data suggests that the clock is ticking on that, and we're running out of time to really be able to pull this back. But I think that, from an archaeological perspective and a paleontological perspective, the consequences of not doing that could be utterly catastrophic. So, yeah.
Our audience likes drawing the connections and the conclusions between the research you guys have done that's based in the past to future and contemporary, or current and contemporary future issues. So that was a great answer. Thank you. And then lastly, I always like to ask this as we're closing, any final thoughts on this topic for our guests before we wrap up for tonight?
I think it's a topic that, still needs a lot of work and that people are still interested in pursuing. there's been some discussions of trying to get back out to the fine location of the Farmington Mastodon and do some soil cores and other types of analyses to try and learn more about the environment of the site where it was found. I think that, there are other Mastodon finds that are still in repositories here in Connecticut that may be possible to date. And I think that, we'll just keep on going. And as new Paleo-Indian sites are discovered, which seems to be happening at a pretty quick rate at this point, there's going to be a lot more to talk about on this topic in the coming years.
Very good.
Yeah, I think that virtually the same thing. It's really exciting that there's energy behind this to go out and start to look at these specimens that have been in museums for, in some cases, over 100 years. And there's more out there than I ever knew about. There's 2 other proboscidean finds in Vermont. Don't know whether mammoth or, no, 3 others beyond the Mount Holly mammoth that I can think of, that I'm aware of. There's a Mastodon Tooth that's been found up there. It's in a private collection, and there are 2 tusks. One's in Brattleboro and one's in like Brandon or something. It's not really well published, but I think we can do more with paleoecology too, right? Which might actually lead to a reasonable research question that could involve those giant beavers to understand what other species are going through as well. So I just think it's great that there's this excitement, and I think we've got a lot to learn, but we're working towards it, and it's really cool.
Wonderful.
So can I ask one last question? I noticed on your animal photo of all your different animals and the saber-toothed tiger and all that, there's a camel on there. And we've learned that the camels are from this part of the, I guess, the Northeast, or not the Northeast, but north of here. Are they originally from this continent? And what did they do? Walk back and ended up in Africa? Because we think of camels coming out of that part of the world, or Asia, not necessarily from North America. Did I say camel on your chart?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Sarah, do you know the taxonomic identity of Camelops and how it's related to other camels?
I don't know about that relationship. No, I'm
All right.
sorry.
It's okay.
It's going to be a 2023 program. We've got the camels and the beavers. We've already filled 2 slots for next year.
But yeah, so camels were here, horses were here.
Yeah.
It's very well documented, and in fact, everyone's favorite camelids are still extant. Llamas and alpacas and their wild counterparts, guanacos and vicuñas. So they still have relatives here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where they came from, but my understanding is, like, interesting enough, like they did walk here. In fact, I think the moose walked over here pretty late. And same, I think, with the gray wolf. So there's some relatively late arrivals that also came over the Bering Land Bridge and walked here. So yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight and with our
Thank you.
audience. And everyone who joined us tonight, thank you. We will make this recording available, and we hope to have you back for another topic, because we're going to be talking about archaeology in Avon for a long time. All right.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.